So this is part three of Eco's 20th century discussion of beauty. Part three is entitled The Beauty of Consumption. So reading Eco again, and I'll try and make sure that you know when it's me and when it's Eco. But our visitor from the future could not avoid making another curious discovery. Visitors to an exhibition of avant-garde art who purchase an incomprehensible sculpture, or those who take part in a happening, are dressed and made up in accordance with the canons of fashion. They wear jeans or designer clothes, wear their hair or makeup in accordance or according to the model of beauty offered by glossy magazines, the cinema or television, in other words, by the mass media. These people follow the ideals of beauty as suggested by the world of commercial consumption and the very world that avant-garde artists have been battling against for over 50 years. How to interpret this contradiction? Without attempting to explain it, we can say that it is the contradiction typical of the 20th century. At this point, the visitor from the future would have to ask himself what the mass media's model of beauty really was, and he would discover that the century was traversed by a double caesura. Okay, so I have two comments here. Number one, right, this is interesting. He's talking about a contradiction typical of the 20th century, right? The fact that visitors to avant-garde art exhibitions and that sort of thing are looking at avant-garde art that has been battling not only the traditional ideals of beauty, but also, mass media visions of beauty and exploitation and commercialization. And yet when they visit that, they're wearing fashions that come from that very mass media. So that's an interesting contradiction. And I wonder, just something to think about, if that's typical of the 21st century too, or if there's something more there. And I kind of think that there is something more. That is, I think the 21st century is maybe even more obvious about the fact that there is this contradiction between the fashion and ideals of beauty that we wear and deal with in everyday life and the fashion and ideals of art. And we sort of separate those. And of course, that's a caesura, right? A pause or a space in between, usually used in poetry, but a caesura means a pause or a space in between parts or lines. Okay, so he says that the mass media's model of beauty really was traversed by a double caesura in the 20th century. And then he has images of famous people, right? He's got Twiggy, Rita Hayworth, Grace Kelly, Brigitte Bardot, Audrey Hepburn, Marlene Dietrich, Anita Ekberg, and then what else? We have some male figures as well here. It looks like Rock Hudson and James Dean. Who else do we have? John Wayne, Fred Astaire, Cary Grant, Marlon Brando, Marcello Mastroianni. So we have this is an amazing set of 20th century images of people who were considered beautiful. So the first of these caesuras, he says, takes the form of a contrast between models in the course of the same decade. Just to provide a few examples, in the same years, the cinema offered the model of the femme fatale, as represented by Greta Garbo and Rita Hayworth, and that of the girl next door, as played by Claudette Colbert or Doris Day. It also gave us the Western hero in the form of the hulking and ultra-virile John Wayne, along with the meek and vaguely effeminate Dustin Hoffman. Gary Cooper and Fred Astaire were contemporaries, and the slightly built Fred Astaire danced with the stockily built Gene Kelly. Fashion offered sumptuous women's wear like the outfits seen in Roberta, and at the same time, it gave us the androgynous designs of Coco Chanel. The mass media are totally democratic, offering a model of beauty for those already naturally endowed with our aristocratic grace, as well as for the voluptuous working class girl. The svelte Audrey Hepburn constituted a model for those women who could not compete with the full-bosomed Anita Ekberg, while for those men who do not possess the refined masculine beauty of Richard Gere, there is the sensitive appeal of Al Pacino and the blue-collar charm of Robert De Niro. And finally, for those who cannot afford the beauty of Maserati, there is the convenient beauty of the Mini. So the 20th century offers a model of beauty kind of for everyone. according to him. And this is one of the key caesuras, right? That this split in the 20th century, right? Beauty doesn't necessarily have to be for the beautiful. It is not elitist, it's democratic. The second caesura split the century in two. All things considered, the ideals of beauty presented by the mass media over the first 60 years of the 20th century refer to models originating in the major arts. Now, by models here, he's not actually talking about fashion models. He's talking about models of beauty, people, clothing, images, architecture that act as a model for the way we think of what is beautiful. So the languorous women who appeared in the ads of the 1920s and 1930s are reminiscent of the slender beauty of the Art Nouveau and Art Deco movements, which also appeared in the 20s and 30s. Advertising material for a variety of products reveals futurist, cubist, and surrealist influences. The Little Nemo strips were inspired by Art Nouveau. The urban scenarios of the worlds that appeared in Flash Gordon comics remind us of the utopias of modernist architects like Santelia, and even anticipate the shape of modern missiles. Dick Tracy's strips express a growing familiarity with avant-garde painting. And at bottom, it suffices to follow Mickey and Minnie Mouse from the 1930s to the 1950s in order to see how the drawings conform to the development of dominant aesthetic sensibilities. Mickey and Minnie Mouse changed shapes, and you've seen that, right? Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie looks completely different from the Mickey Mouse of the 1950s and even from the 1970s and the wonderful world of Disney on Sunday night TV, right? So Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse changed with the aesthetic sensibilities that changed throughout the course of the 20th century. But when pop art took over, pop art was a movement, and one of its signature adherents was Andy Warhol. So if you're interested, look at Andy Warhol's art. But when pop art took over and began to turn out provocative experimental works based on images from the worlds of commerce, right? A great example of this is Warhol's soup cans or Campbell's soup cans painting, right? Or his Marilyn Monroe in various different monochromatic shades. So when pop art took over and began to turn out provocative experimental works based on images from the worlds of commerce, industry, and the mass media, and when the Beatles skillfully reworked certain traditional musical forms, the gap between the art of provocation and the art of consumption grew narrower. What is more, while it seems that there is still a gap between cultivated and popular art, in the climate of the so-called postmodern period, which is now, cultivated art offers new experimental work that goes beyond visual art and revivals of visual art at one and the same time, as the tradition is continually reassessed. So I want to get back to this key concept here that Umberto Eco is talking about, right? He's talking about the art of provocation and the art of consumption, and there's a gap between them. The art of provocation he defines as avant-garde art that challenges both traditional norms of beauty and also media stereotypes of beauty. Whereas the art of consumption is, of course, the fashion, the art, the images and ideas that we get from the media and that we use in advertising and that we consume as individuals. And these two really sort of contradict each other and yet exist in the same space. So for their part, the mass media no longer present any unified model, any single ideal of beauty. They can retrieve, even for an advertising campaign destined to last only a week, all the experimental work of the avant-garde, and at the same time offer models from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, even in the outmoded forms of automobiles from the mid-century. The mass media continue to serve up warmed-over versions of 19th century iconography, the Juno-esque opulence of Mae West, and the anorexic charms of the latest fashion models, the dusky beauty of Naomi Campbell, and the Nordic beauty of Claudia Schiffer, the grace of traditional tap dancing as a chorus line, and the chilling futuristic architectures of Blade Runner, the femme fatale of dozens of television shows or advertising campaigns, and squeaky clean girls next door like Julia Roberts or Cameron Diaz, Rambo and RuPaul, George Clooney with his short hair and neo-cyborgs who paint their faces in metallic shades and transform their hair into forests of colored spikes or shave their heads. Our explorer from the future will no longer be able to identify the aesthetic ideal diffused by the mass media of the 20th century and beyond. He will have to surrender before the orgy of tolerance, the total syncretism, and the absolute and unstoppable polytheism of beauty. So here we go, right? Eco is essentially telling us that beauty today, or certainly when he was writing in the end of the 20th century, beauty was so democratic that it was, in a sense, diverse, that diversity itself was beauty, right? And that there was a beauty available for anyone who was looking for their own sort of style of beauty. So as many kinds of beauty as there are people, right? Beauty then is entirely subjective. And yet at the same time, many of us can perceive beauty even in objects that we don't find beautiful ourselves. Beauty exists within experience, but beauty also exists within observed material items, and beauty can exist in observing someone who does something extremely well. All of these things are beauty, and therefore the advertising industry has all of those to choose from now in the 20th century, as the image of beauty is democratic. And it may be, right, that this also has to do with the very democratic nature of the self, right? In the late 20th century and early 21st century, in the postmodern era that we're in, the idea of a unitary self, the idea that I am me, and that there is something, some core self that makes me what I am, has sort of gone by the wayside. And instead, we see ourselves as multiple selves, fractured, broken, not necessarily, but multiple selves who behave differently in different circumstances. And of course, that fits with this idea of multiple beauties that operate differently for each individual within a democratic society. Thanks for listening. I hope that Eco's ideas were useful to you.